The origins of the Cherokee are considered a mystery by modern scholars. Academics used to pontificate about the possibility that the Cherokee were actually a band that split off from the Westo Empire. These Indians, known as the Westo to the English and the Chichimeco to the Spanish, became the most powerful military force in the area to English, Spanish, and Amerindian alike.
Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up out of your sleep! Sleep!
European colonization of North America is a tragic story, but it's woefully misunderstood because of preconceived notions children get taught in social studies class. So textbooks have us thinking that Europeans came to the continent with evil hearts, more advanced weapons, and unstoppable warfare, which led to the eradication of Native Americans. But there's so much wrong with that sentence. Firstly, European warfare was at best on par with American Indian warfare. Secondly, European weapons were more advanced only in design and technological novelty, but they actually rendered inferior results on the battlefield. Lastly, the term Native American is a legal designation referring only to the descendants of federally recognized families removed from Aboriginal lands to Indian reservations, initially referred to as half-breed tracts because they were the ones who had mixed with Europeans, which we covered in a previous video. Most American Indians were excluded from that recognition, but that doesn't make them any less indigenous. Before we prove the other points, let me just remind you that only 388,747 slaves ever landed on the North American mainland coming from anywhere at all. That's a statistical fact. Despite less than 400,000 slaves being foreign, the 1860 U.S. Census tallied well over 10 times as many colored people in the general population, most of whom were enslaved. That's another equally indisputable fact. I always remind you of these facts so that you can understand how incredibly likely it is for many of their so-called African American descendants to actually be American Indians, because most of these colored people should be indigenous even after accounting for slave breeding. In 2002, Yale University Press published a book by Alan Gallay, a history professor at Western Washington University. It's called The Indian Slave Trade, The Rise of the English Empire in the South, 1670 to 1717. Chapter 2 talks about the Westo Empire in the Carolina colony back in the late 1600s. Read this, quote, "These Indians, known as the Westo to the English and the Chichimeco to the Spanish, became the most powerful military force in the area to English, Spanish, and Amerindian alike. The Westo had just migrated to the Savannah River from Virginia, where they were known as the Richaikrian, or Richaikrian is how that should be pronounced. One anthropologist, Marvin T. Smith, believes them to have been displaced Erie, an Iroquoian group, from New York and Pennsylvania, who had been forced south by the Iroquois Wars of 1654 to 1656. The expansion of English Virginia westward pressured the Powhatan and other Virginia Amerindians, which forced the Westo to migrate again, but not before having established trade relations with English Virginians. From their new home along the Savannah, they aggressively attacked Southern Indians to the east, southeast, and south. Smith claims that the Virginians' arming of the Westo gave them undue advantage, forcing the technologically inferior bands to the south to confederate as the Creek Indians. The new weaponry, however, he's about to say, that's what Smith was saying, but he's about to disagree. The new weaponry, however, the guns, could scarcely have provided the Westo with anything more than a psychological advantage. For the firepower of 17th century guns paled in comparison to the bow and arrow, which could be shot more frequently and accurately. Guns were not better than bow and arrow at the time. They were just fancier. The acquisition of guns alone is insufficient to explain why the Westo terrorized their neighbors. Instead, because guns could not have made them that great. They must have been that great without guns. Anyway. Instead, Westo aggression can be attributed to the two forced migrations in the 15 years before they arrived on the savannah and their desperate need to carve out living space. Just how many Westo migrated is unknown, though the Spanish reported that they had variously 500 and 2,000 gunmen, big difference, which implies a population of 1,700 to 8,000. Again, big difference. A group of Amerindians of that size required a large territory, hundreds of square miles, most of which was needed for hunting to sustain itself. The Westo relationship with Virginia traders also shaped the nature of their aggressiveness toward their neighbors. The Virginians offered trade goods to the Westo in exchange for captives. It made more sense to the Westo to devote their energy to enslaving Amerindians than to hunting and processing pelts. Instead of killing their enemies or intimidating them to flee, the Westo sold them to the English, which not only removed their foes but gained them something in return. Their single-mindedness to gain land and their organizational skills, tactics, and trade connections gave them numerous advantages over the region's other Indians. They mortally wounded the Spanish mission system in Guale and Mocama, located on the Georgia and North Florida seacoast, while inducing some of Carolina's coastal Indians to welcome the English into the region as an ally. End quote. So some of the Carolina Indians started allying with the English too, because they knew that was the only way they could compete with the Westo. See what the Westo were doing caused more of them to also embrace the European. This is how the European got in, not by being superior. So let's unpack that excerpt. Professor Gallet saying that the Westo Empire had the most powerful military in the area, quite possibly including the English themselves. They did get guns by trading with the English, but 17th century firearms weren't worth much to them as weapons because their own affinity for bow and arrow was a more efficient and more accurate form of warfare anyway. Back then, firearms were super inaccurate, and each round had to be loaded manually using a difficult process. Arrows could be pulled from a quiver and shot one after the other much more rapidly, and Westo Indians apparently hit their marks with most shots, so they would have seen guns as an inferior weapon. Europeans couldn't defeat the Westo, but the Westo could defeat other Indians for the English, which they did. And they traded their indigenous prisoners of war to the English as slaves to clear more land and claim more territory. Don't forget, the Westo were new to the Carolina region, so they needed to expand their land as fast as possible. This is how they did it, and how the English colony gained its slaves in the late 1600s. The slaves were Indians.
Hey y'all! First of all, like and subscribe to the channel, but also, Unahia is recruiting, and if you don't know what Unahia is, we're a grassroots activist group lobbying Congress to amend a bill to require education and research to acknowledge the Negro origins of Aboriginal groups of North America. If any of you have it to give, please support the campaign using the QR code on your screen, join the campaign with a donation, and if you have the time, you can even join our staff to help guide the organization, not just for this campaign, but also future endeavors. Don't speak about it, be about it. Let's go.
Now, there's no way to verify the Westo phenotype, but we can look at other Aborigines from the East Coast to get a good idea. Check out Ninigret during this exact same time period. He's the sachem of the Neantic Indians of Rhode Island, and he had this portrait made in 1681. It's now sitting in the Rhode Island School of Design Museum. The portrait depicts his skin tone as being roughly the same as mine. And there are lots of so-called black people much lighter than Ninigre or myself. Also, Native Americans might argue that his hair is straight here and that this distinguishes him from so-called black Americans. But you have to understand what you're looking at. Look at how his hair sits up on his shoulder. No straight hair of that length ever has that much volume. No Hispanics or Europeans can lay their hair over their shoulder and have such a thick bundle of hair resting on top of said shoulder. That's what coarse hair looks like when it's washed and greased multiple times a day. This is Negro complexion with Negro hair. Now, the book said the Westo are theorized to be from the Great Lakes region up north, which is why I consider it relevant to look at Rhode Island Indians, since Rhode Island's up north too. However, we can also look at how William Penn described the Lenape while we're at it, since they were also further north, yet closer to Virginia and Carolina. William Penn was the founder and governor of the Pennsylvania colony, which was named after him. In his letter to the Committee of the Free Society of Traders in London, he described Lenape Indians saying, quote, "Of complexion, black, but by design," meaning the form of the shape of their bodies, "as the gypsies in England. They greased themselves with bear's fat clarified, and using no defense against sun or weather, their skins must needs be swarthy." See that? The Indians in Pennsylvania were described as not just swarthy, but black. He called them black people. These people were a stone's throw away from the Powhatan opposite the Westo in 1683. For the Westo, the Lenape would be in one direction, and in the opposite direction, the Powhatan. See what I'm saying? And mind you, of course, don't miss that bear's fat clarified. They greased themselves. They would grease their hair. Let's look at the Powhatan, which is actually the name of this statue at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. It's part of the so-called Story of Virginia exhibit. You'll notice the phenotype of the Powhatan Indian favors Dwayne Wade. Look at the back of his head and observe the texture of his hair. That's nappy hair. The Hichiti principle. The Ichiti principle. 1 is an incident, 2 is a coincidence, 3 is a pattern. We're seeing a pattern that shows different tribes north of the Westo were clearly black people who frequently washed and greased their hair. So we've established that we're talking about black people when we're talking about American Indians on the Atlantic coast. Black people raided other lands and took as many enemies alive as possible to sell them as slaves to white people. Academics used to pontificate about the possibility that the Cherokee were actually a band that split off from the Westo Empire. Today, most scholars doubt a direct connection between Cherokee and Westo, but the reason it matters is because the Cherokee behaved just like the Westo. They took every opportunity to enslave Indians and ally with the Europeans against other Indian nations. Page 111 of Indians of the Southeastern United States, a book by historian John Reed Swanton, quote, "It is now known quite definitely that the Rechaikrians," that's the Westo name mentioned in Alan Galay's book, "who won a battle against the allied Powhatan Indians and Virginia colonists in 1656, were not Cherokee." So it is now known, he's saying, that those are not Cherokee. But whoever they are, these Westo, they whooped the Powhatan and Virginia colonists put together. And there is no certainty that the now it's spelled differently. Ricohokins. The reason it's spelled differently, there are multiple spellings, and you encounter this when you study the Westo. You end up finding different spellings, and that is because they're trying to account for the glottal non-velar fricative sound that you hear in this word, in the back of the throat, Rechaikrians or Rechokins. They're trying to get it right, and it's difficult to do, but that's why we've got the different phonetics from one spelling to another. There is no certainty that the Rechokins of whom Lederer speaks were of that tribe, meaning that there's no proof that they're Cherokee. One of the earliest appearances of the name in English narratives is in Woodward's account of his visit to the Westo town on Savannah River in 1674, in which he states the Coato and Cherokee Indians lived on the head branches of the Savannah. End quote. That's supposed to be telling you about one of the earliest mentions of the word Cherokee as a name of a tribe, written in 1674, or actually written about them being on the Westo River, on the Savannah River, which is the river that the Westo pretty much owned completely, all the land around it. And he's saying that the Cherokee Indians lived on the head branches of that Savannah River in what was then the Carolina colony. He's talking about the Savannah River in the Carolina colony. It's the heart of the Westo territory to which Galay said they migrated. Yet one of the earliest mentions of there even being a Cherokee people places them right in Westo territory. Both Westo and Cherokee also were the only two Iroquois speakers in the southeastern U.S. by the time of first contact with Europeans. Mind you, the origins of the Cherokee are considered a mystery by modern scholars. Did you know that? They don't actually know where the Cherokee come from for real. Voices of America reports, quote, slavery in America is usually associated with Africa and the American South. But Ohio State University historian Margaret Ellen Newell told VOA, Voices of America, that up until 1700, Native Americans comprised the majority of slaves in America, end quote. The slaves were Indians, and not because the English were so formidable, but because indigenous nations turned on each other and sold each other as slaves to the English. Fast forward to the beginning of the 1800s, I covered in a previous video how the Cherokee split into biracial Indians and full-blood Indians. The full-bloods lived isolated in the woods, while the mixed ones lived in urban centers of the territory. Slavery was the major difference between them. The Euro-Indians predominantly owned slaves, while the full-bloods didn't. Here's another book entitled After the Trail of Tears: The Cherokees' Struggle for Sovereignty, 1839 to 1880. Page 73. Quote, while slavery was less common among full-blood Cherokee because these people tended to live in more isolated settlements away from European American influence and trade, both full-blood and mixed-blood Cherokee became slave owners, end quote. This page is missing from the preview in Google Books, but you can verify that it says this by going to this Wikipedia page, which quotes it. You can also type each word into the text search bar in the Google Books preview to find these phrases in that book. The mixed ones are the ones who got swept up in Indian removal, and the full-bloods left behind became part of general population as whites moved into the territory because those full-blood Indians were living in isolated settlements in the woods. Again, I covered all that in previous videos, which I'll put on the screen at the end of this one. The mixed Cherokee became known as Native Americans, and the slaves they took with them are called Cherokee freedmen. This is how American Indians destroyed each other. Europeans didn't win with superior warfare. They won by fueling the rivalries that already existed between indigenous nations whose warfare was actually superior to that of the Europeans. The Cherokee were just like the Westo, and we'll explore the connection between those two peoples in a future video very soon. But suffice it to say, opportunistic warrior tribes created the downfall of all tribes. The First Nations of Turtle Island used the Europeans as a means to an end, and that end was to destroy other First Nations and thereby remove competition for sustenance on the land.
Descendants of black people enslaved by members of Native American tribes in the 1800s have still not been allowed to become full tribal citizens. And Congresswoman Maxine Waters is pushing to withhold federal funding for tribes that do not recognize freedmen as full citizens. 2 Oklahoma tribes have announced that they are considering changes to their constitutions to allow freedmen full rights, but months later, after their consideration, there's still little signs of progress.
You know, it's not about a consideration. They're breaking the law. They're the Treaty of 1866, Article 2, that specifically states that people like myself have the full citizenship rights within the Creek Nation. They are completely ignoring that law, and at this time, the Biden administration is allowing them to get away with that. They've stolen our birthright, they've stolen our culture, they've stolen our history, and as my client Rhonda Grayson stated in the clip with Tremaine Lee, they also stolen billions of dollars in benefits that we are owed to this very day, and this has been going on since 1979. We have done everything we possibly can. We've sued in federal court. We currently have a lawsuit in the Creek Nation court system where they have not even assigned a judge in almost a year.
I'm curious, what's the vibe like in Tulsa, though? Like when freedmen are around, some of the indigenous communities, what's it like?
Listen, they completely treat us like Jim Crow South. We are segregated. We are not recognized. I've had hundreds of clients go down and try to get citizenship, and they would tell them to their face, you're not an Indian, you're a Negro, you're a formerly enslaved person. We do not want you. My grandmother, Johnny Mae Simmons, who passed away a couple years ago, she was born a Creek citizen. She spoke Creek, and then just arbitrarily she was denied and stripped of her citizenship in 1979.
Any update on the Tulsa survivor case?
No update. We've been waiting 31 days for a decision that allows us to move forward, and I just want to say that we still need everyone to think about that and go to justiceforgreenwood.org for more updates.
All right, we will do that. Thank you so much, Demario Solomon Simmons. You'll have to come back.